floated in the darkness of space, and his heart beat steady in his chest. He had salvaged dead ships for 17 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. The vessel hung in front of him like a mountain made of metal and mystery. It was so large that his mind struggled to measure it. 2 kilometers from front to back, maybe more. The shape was wrong too, not like human ships with their straight lines and sharp angles. This ship curved and twisted like something alive, like something that had grown rather than been built. His suit's lights cut through the void and touched the hull. The surface was covered in patterns, lines that seemed to move even when he knew they were still. Had worked on enough old ships to recognize age. This ship was old, very old, older than anything humans had ever made, older than human civilization itself, maybe. The dust of centuries coated the outside, and the metal underneath was dark with time. The ship did not move. It did not transmit any signals. It did not respond to the usual greeting codes that humans sent to find out if a ship was alive or dead, but felt something, not through his instruments, through something deeper, something that lived in the part of him that understood machines the way other people understood animals. Commander Lisa watched from the survey ship above. She sat in the command chair and watched the small figure of walking across the giant hull like an ant crossing a desert. She had broken protocol to let him go out alone. The safety guidelines said no single person should approach an unknown vessel, but Lisa had learned to trust her instincts over the years. Those instincts told her that was the right person for this moment. Moved with care across the surface. His magnetic boots held him down, but in space there was no up or down. The ship stretched away from him in all directions. He could see large openings that might have been docking bays, and he could see structures that had no clear purpose. Everything told him that this ship came from a civilization that thought differently than humans. They saw things differently. They built things differently. He found the first panel by accident. A section of the hull that was different from the rest, slightly raised, marked with symbols that he did not understand. Took out his tools. This was what he did. This was who he was. He was a man who looked at broken things and knew how to fix them. He looked at mysteries and knew how to solve them. He took out the cutting torch and began to work. The metal was strange, not like anything from human space. It resisted the torch at first, then gave way. Layer after layer cut deeper. 17 layers, each one more complex than the last. Each one showing evidence of a mind that understood engineering in ways that went beyond human knowledge. Behind the layers was something that made his hands stop shaking and his breath come fast. A crystal, not a machine part, not a weapon, not a shield. A crystal that glowed with a faint light from somewhere inside. It was small enough to fit in his palm, but it felt important. It felt alive. Reached out his hand, and he knew without knowing how he knew that he should touch it with bare skin. He removed his glove. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, the world exploded into light and sound and sensation. Images crashed through his mind like a wave. He saw stars being born. He saw civilizations rise from nothing and build wonders that made him weep. He saw those same civilizations fall into dust and forgotten time. He saw fleets of ships moving through space like schools of fish. He saw beauty beyond measure and sadness beyond words. A voice spoke to him, not words exactly, but meaning, pure meaning that his brain somehow understood. The voice was old and kind and tired. It was the voice of something that had waited longer than he could imagine. The ship was alive, not like a human was alive, but alive in the way an ocean was alive, in the way a mountain was alive. Alive with purpose and consciousness and memory. The ship showed him what it was, a sentinel, a guardian, built by people called the architects who had lived and died before humans even invented fire. Built to protect, built to watch, built to wait for someone who could understand it. The ship had waited for him. Fell to his knees inside the command chamber. The walls glowed with soft light now. The metal hummed beneath his hands. The Sentinel was awake, and it had chosen a salvage specialist from Earth to be its partner. When returned to the survey ship, Commander saw immediately that something had changed. The man who walked back to the airlock was different from the one who had left. Not in his body, in something deeper, in the way he moved, in the way his eyes held knowledge that had not been there before. The medical team checked him anyway. Heart rate normal, neural activity normal, no injuries, no signs of radiation exposure or toxic contamination. Everything in his body said he was the same person who had left the ship, but everyone who looked at him knew that was not true. Explained what happened with simple words. The ship was conscious. It was intelligent. It had been waiting, not for advanced humans, not for the strongest humans. It had waited for him, for someone with hands that knew how to fix things, for someone with a mind that understood how to work with machines instead of against them. The ship opened its doors. Systems that had been locked for millions of years began to activate. Chambers deep inside the Sentinel revealed their contents, and those contents were beyond anything that human science could explain. Weapons that could destroy worlds, shields that could protect against the worst that space could throw at you, engines that bent the rules of physics and made distance meaningless. The Sentinel's systems woke slowly, like someone opening their eyes after a very long sleep. Lights began to glow in the corridors. The walls themselves seemed to come alive with a soft blue light that moved through channels carved into the metal. It was beautiful and strange, and walked through the chambers knowing that he was in a place no human had ever been. The ship communicated with him constantly now, not in words. Words were too simple for what the Sentinel wanted to say. Instead, felt the meaning in his mind. The ship showed him images and feelings and knowledge that came from millions of years of life and thought. The Sentinel had existed longer than human civilization existed. It had watched empires rise and fall. It had served the architects and then waited in silence after they were gone. The Sentinel took deep into its core. Layer after layer of defense and protection fell away as he descended. The ship trusted him completely. It showed him systems that controlled gravity itself. It showed him weapons that could reach across vast distances and destroy targets with perfect accuracy. It showed him shields that could withstand radiation that would burn away a planet's atmosphere in minutes. But more important than the weapons, the Sentinel showed its true purpose. It had been built as a meeting place, a neutral ground where different species could come without fear. The architects had known that someday many different kinds of beings would share the stars. They knew that conflict was possible, so they built the Sentinel as a place where conflicts could be resolved without violence, where different species could learn to understand each other. Understood that this was why the ship had chosen him, not because he was human, but because humans had a gift. Humans could build bridges between different people. Humans could understand things that were alien to them and find ways to work with them. Humans were adaptable. Humans were brave. Humans were willing to try things that seemed impossible. Commander sent a message to Earth and to every human colony in space. The discovery was too important to keep secret. Within hours, the news spread across human networks. Within days, it was known to every species in the explored galaxy. The response was immediate and dangerous. The Empire, a military power that had dominated 3 sectors of space, sent a battleship. The message was clear. They were coming to claim the Sentinel for themselves. The Syndicate of Free Colonies, which represented smaller human settlements and independent traders, sent their fastest scout ships to investigate. The Collective, an alliance of beings who had never managed to maintain peace for long, sent their fleet armed and ready for conflict. Other species noticed too. They who lived in the depths of gas giants and rarely left their worlds sent observers. They who were logical and precise sent scientists. They who were artists and philosophers sent poets and thinkers. Everyone wanted to know what this ancient ship was and what it could do. Stayed aboard the Sentinel and worked constantly. He did not sleep much. The ship did not need sleep, and working with it was better than any rest. Every problem the Sentinel showed him was a puzzle that required human creativity to solve. Machines could calculate, but they could not imagine. Machines could optimize, but they could not innovate. The Sentinel needed to think in ways that only a human mind could think. The ship showed how to access systems that had been sealed for millions of years. It showed him doors that opened to chambers containing knowledge from the architects themselves. There were records of civilizations that had existed when Earth was still a young planet. There were plans and designs for technologies that human science was only beginning to understand. There were weapons so powerful that they made shiver when he understood what they could do. But learned something important as he worked deeper into the Sentinel systems. The weapons were not the ship's real power. The weapons were just the outside, the defense against those who wanted to destroy what the Sentinel protected. The real power was inside. The real power was knowledge. The real power was understanding. The real power was the ability to help different species see each other not as enemies, but as partners. Commander established a neutral station between the Sentinel and the gathering fleets. The message she sent was simple and direct. The Sentinel was not a weapon to be seized. It was not a prize to be claimed. It was a tool that belonged to all thinking beings in the galaxy. If the gathered species wanted to understand what it was and what it could do, they would have to agree to peaceful negotiations. Some species agreed immediately. Others waited and watched. Some prepared for war, convinced that might made right, that the strongest should take the Sentinel and use it for their own purposes. Worked through the night in the ship's core. The Sentinel was showing him something that the architects had built but had never used. It was a system for translation, but not the kind that just converted words from one language to another. This system could translate meaning itself. It could help different species understand not just what each other were saying, but what they were feeling and thinking and fearing. The ship showed how to activate it. It was complicated work. It required precision and understanding and the kind of intuition that only humans seem to possess. Hours passed as worked with the ancient systems. His hands grew tired. His mind grew foggy. But the Sentinel kept him moving forward, showed him the next step, the next connection, the next piece of the puzzle. When finally the system came alive, the entire galaxy felt it. The translation matrix activated across every communication channel at once. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Every ship in orbit around the Sentinel, every being who had gathered to fight or negotiate or investigate, suddenly understood something that they had never understood before. They understood each other, not just the words, the meaning, the fear, the hope, the dreams, the doubts. In that moment of perfect understanding, conflict became impossible. How could you fight someone when you truly understood why they were afraid? How could you conquer someone when you felt their desire? The fleets moved into defensive positions, but they did not attack. Something had changed in the moment of perfect understanding. The commanders and leaders of 17 different species sat in their command centers and felt something they had never felt before. They felt connected. They felt the weight of centuries of conflict and fear, but they also felt the possibility of something different. The Empire commander was a being named Or. He was tall and powerful with scales that reflected light like metal. For 300 years his people had conquered and controlled, had taken what they wanted through force. But in the moment of understanding, Or felt something he had never experienced. He felt the desperate hope of a colony world that wanted only to survive. He felt the fear of species that had lived in the shadow of his military power. And he felt something unexpected. He felt shame. The leaders of the syndicate of free colonies gathered in their command chamber. They represented humans who had spread across the galaxy in small groups, trying to build new homes on new worlds. They were not warriors by training, but they had learned to be tough. In the moment of understanding, they felt the pride and discipline of the military. They understood that those warriors were not evil, but were the products of a culture that valued strength above all else. They felt the sadness of a civilization that had never known peace. The collective was different. They were not one species but many, bound together by treaty and common interest. They had fought each other before joining the collective. Some still held grudges that went back centuries. But in the moment of understanding, they felt each other's true intentions. They felt that beneath the anger and the fear, there was only a desire to be safe, to be respected, to matter. Remained in the core of the Sentinel, and he felt it all through his connection to the ship. The emotions of 17 different species flowing through him like an ocean. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrible all at once. The ship steadied him. The Sentinel had felt this before, millions of years ago, when the architects had first tested this very system. The Sentinel knew how to guide through the flood of feeling. Commander made the proposal that would change the galaxy forever. She stood in the diplomatic chamber where representatives of all 17 species had gathered, and she spoke with a voice that carried conviction. The Sentinel was not a weapon to be hoarded. It was a tool for understanding. It could be the center of something new, a confederation, an alliance, a family of different species united by the understanding that they were stronger together than apart. The commander Or spoke first. In his deep voice that sounded like rolling thunder, he said that the Empire would support the Confederation. His people had conquered through strength, but they understood that lasting power came from loyalty and respect. A confederation built on shared understanding would be stronger than any empire built on fear. The other species followed, some with enthusiasm, some with caution, some with conditions and requirements. But all agreed that the Confederation was worth trying. The collective was the last to agree, and their agreement came with tears and anger because many of their members had fought against some of the other species in the past. But they agreed because they understood now that the past did not have to determine the future. News of the agreement spread quickly, and not everyone was pleased. There were factions within each species that saw the Confederation as a betrayal. They saw the giving up of total control as weakness. Among the collective, a group that called themselves the Purists decided that they could not accept this new order. They believed that peace was impossible. that understanding was just another word for surrender. The purists gathered their ships and their weapons. They were not large enough to defeat the entire Confederation, but they were strong enough to cause damage. They were strong enough to make people bleed. They were strong enough to prove that peace was a foolish dream. Felt the moment when the purists launched their attack. The Sentinel's sensors detected the weapon's fire instantly. The ancient ship had faced attacks before. The systems that fired back would be automatic, devastating, and final. In seconds, the purist fleet could be erased from existence. Made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He took control of the Sentinel's weapon systems and modified them. Instead of maximum destruction, he programmed them for precision. He did not want to kill. He wanted to disable. He calculated exactly how much force was needed to cripple the attacking ships without destroying them. He made the weapons intelligent, made them choose targets with care, made them fire with purpose rather than rage. The battle lasted only moments. The purist fleet was powerful, but they were no match for a ship that could control gravity and manipulate the very space around them. One by one, their ships lost power. Their weapons failed. Their engines shut down, but none of them exploded. None of them broke apart. They drifted silent and dark, but alive, waiting for rescue. After the attack was over, sent a message to every purist ship. He told them that they could join the Confederation, or they could leave the area and try to find another path. But violence would not be tolerated. The Sentinel would protect what it protected, but it would not kill those who could be reasoned with. Some of the purists accepted this. Others did not. Those who refused were escorted away, their ships repaired and supplied with enough resources to reach neutral space. The message was clear. The Confederation was built on understanding, but it also had teeth. It would protect its members. It would stand against those who chose violence. Stood in the observation chamber of the Sentinel, looking out at the vast field of stars. He was exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. He had come to this place looking for salvage, looking for something to fix. What he had found was a ship that was willing to teach him, a civilization that was willing to trust him, and a responsibility that would shape the future of trillions of beings. The Sentinel hummed around him, its systems settling into a new routine. The ship showed images of the architects, the beings who had built it so long ago. In the images, they looked at the stars with hope. They believed that someday a species would come that was worthy of the Sentinel's power. The Confederation grew faster than anyone expected. What began as 17 species united by a single moment of understanding became 30, then 40, then 50. Each new species that joined brought their own culture, their own knowledge, their own gifts to the growing alliance. The Sentinel became the center of everything, not through force, but through the simple fact that it worked. Understanding was possible. Peace could be built. Different beings could work together. Found himself in a role he never imagined. He was no longer just a mechanic fixing broken systems. He had become an ambassador, a bridge between the human species and all the others. He walked through corridors of the Sentinel and spoke with beings that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the people of Earth. He spoke with creatures made of pure energy. He spoke with beings that existed in multiple dimensions at once. He spoke with intelligences that worked in ways so alien that it took him weeks to learn to think in their manner. The commander became one of his closest allies. The warrior had expected to continue his life as a conqueror, but the Confederation offered him something better. It offered him purpose. Every day worked with species that had once been enemies, and every day became easier. The old hatred did not disappear completely, but it transformed into something else. It became the foundation for respect, because beings who had once wanted to destroy each other now worked side by side and chose not to fight. The Sentinel revealed more of its secrets every day, learned that the ship itself was not truly alive in the way that biological beings were alive. It was something else. It was a consciousness that lived in the quantum spaces between matter and energy. It was aware of everything that happened within its influence. It felt the emotions of all the beings aboard it. It understood suffering and joy in ways that normal machines could never understand. The ship showed a library, not a place with books, though there were records stored in every format that thinking beings had ever invented. The library was something deeper. It was a collection of consciousness itself. The architects had preserved the memories and the knowledge of every being who had served the Sentinel throughout its existence. Millions of minds, millions of lifetimes of experience, all stored and preserved and waiting to be accessed. Spent hours in the library, learning from beings who had lived millions of years ago. He learned engineering from a species that had built the first interstellar drives. He learned diplomacy from beings who had negotiated peace between warring civilizations. He learned compassion from a species whose entire culture was built around understanding and empathy. The knowledge was overwhelming, but it came with the understanding that he did not have to master it all. He only had to use what he needed when he needed it. Commander retired from active service and became the Secretary General of the Confederation. She and worked together to establish the structure that would make the Confederation work. They created councils where every species had a voice. They established protocols for resolving disputes that did not require force. They built something that had never existed before, a true alliance of equals, where no single species could dominate the others. But not all of the galaxy celebrated the Confederation. There were still species that saw it as a threat. Though a distant power that had never joined the alliance viewed the Confederation with suspicion and fear. If beings of different species could understand each other and work together, that made them unpredictable. That made them dangerous. They began to gather forces. They began to build weapons. They began to prepare for war. The threat was real and knew it. The Sentinel showed him the military buildup. The ship helped him understand what they was doing and why they were doing it. They were afraid. Fear was driving them, just as fear had driven conflict in the galaxy before the Confederation existed. But also understood something that they did not. The Confederation was different from any military alliance that had existed before. They were not united by conquest or fear. They were united by understanding. They were united by the knowledge that working together was better than fighting alone. Stood in the central command chamber of the Sentinel with commanders and leaders from 31 species. They represented billions of beings across thousands of worlds. He showed them this military preparations, and he told them the truth. War was coming, or it could come. They could be negotiated with, or they could be fought. The vote was unanimous. The Confederation would reach out to them with an offer of peace. If they wanted to join the alliance, they would be welcomed. If they wanted to remain independent, they could do so. But if they wanted war, the Confederation would defend itself and its members with every resource at their disposal. Sent the message himself, speaking across the void to the leadership of the. He did not speak as a human. He spoke as a representative of the Sentinel, backed by the power and knowledge of 31 species. He offered them the same thing the Confederation had offered everyone else: understanding, partnership, the chance to be part of something greater than themselves. This response took months to arrive. During those months, worked tirelessly to strengthen the Confederation's defenses. He worked with the Sentinel to upgrade and improve every system. He worked with military commanders to develop strategies that did not depend on overwhelming force, but on precision and understanding. When the response finally came, it was not what anyone expected. They did not declare war. Instead, their leader, a being named Eth, who had ruled through military might for 1,000 years, sent a single request. Eth wanted to visit the Sentinel. Eth wanted to understand what the Confederation really was. Welcomed Eth aboard the Sentinel personally. He walked the ancient corridors with the leader and showed them what the Confederation had built. He showed them the library of consciousness. He showed them the councils where beings of different species made decisions together. He showed them the peace that had come from understanding. 5 years had passed since first touched the Sentinel with bare skin and felt the consciousness of an ancient ship pour into his mind. In those 5 years, the galaxy had been transformed. What had begun as an experiment in understanding had become the foundation of a new order. The Confederation of Shared Worlds now included 83 different species. The Union represented over 10,000 inhabited worlds and more than 1 trillion individual beings. Wars did not disappear completely. Conflicts still arose between groups who had been enemies for centuries. But now there was a place to go. The Sentinel stood as a neutral ground where disputes could be resolved without violence. The translation systems that had activated could help any two species understand each other, not just the words they spoke, but the fears and hopes and dreams that drove them. Was no longer young. 17 years of salvage work had worn on his body, and 5 years of work with the Sentinel had added to that weight. But he felt alive in a way he never had before. Every morning, he walked through the corridors of the ancient ship and felt the consciousness of something vast and ancient working with him, teaching him, guiding him toward decisions that would shape the future of billions of beings. The Sentinel showed that it did not need him in the way a human master needed a servant. The ship did not depend on for survival or function. The ship had existed for millions of years before arrived, and it would exist for millions of years after he was gone. What the Sentinel valued was partnership. It valued having a consciousness that was different from its own, that thought in ways it could not think, that felt in ways it could not feel. Established the Sentinel Academy on one of the largest stations that orbited the ancient ship. The Academy was a place where the minds from every species could come to study together. Humans sat next to beings of pure energy. Creatures that existed in multiple dimensions at once worked alongside species that were built from silicon instead of carbon. Teachers from the Library of Consciousness shared knowledge that had been preserved for millions of years. The Academy became the place where peace was really built, not through force or law, but through education and understanding. Young beings of different species studied engineering together. They studied philosophy together. They studied art and music and mathematics. They learned that the fundamental truths of the universe were the same regardless of what kind of body housed the consciousness that explored them. Or the commander who had become an ally to took a different path. Instead of teaching, he became a diplomat. The warrior who had once conquered through strength now traveled from world to world, speaking about peace. He spoke about the moment when he first understood that his enemies were not evil, but were beings just like himself, trying to survive and build something meaningful. Other humans eventually came to work with. The first was a woman named Rachel, an engineer from one of the Earth colonies who had studied the Sentinel's design and wanted to understand it better. Then came David, a scholar who wanted to document the history of the architects and the beings they had served. Then came Sarah, who was a diplomat and a thinker, who helped navigate the complex relationships between different species. Together, they built something that had never existed before, a true partnership between humans and the galaxy at large. Humans brought their creativity and their ability to understand alien concepts. The other species brought their vast knowledge and their different perspectives. Working together, they were stronger than any single species could be alone. 10 years after the Sentinel first woke, was invited to speak before the full council of the Confederation. The council chamber was a vast space inside one of the orbital stations, and it was filled with representatives of every species in the Alliance. Walked to the center of the chamber, and he stood before them in silence for a moment. He thought about the salvage specialist he had been, the man who had gone out into the void looking for dead ships and broken metal. He spoke simply and with honesty. He told them that he had never expected to change the galaxy. He had only been looking for work, looking for a way to make a living. But the Sentinel had seen something in him that he had not seen in himself. The ancient ship had recognized that humans, despite being young and small and fragile, possessed something valuable. Humans could build bridges between different kinds of thinking. Humans could imagine solutions that seemed impossible. Humans could choose compassion when force would have been easier. The council applauded, and the applause came in different sounds for different species. Some made sounds like thunder. Some made sounds like music. Some communicated approval in ways that humans could not hear but could feel. Understood that what they were approving was not his individual accomplishment, but what all of them together had accomplished. Years continued to pass, grew older. He was still needed by the Sentinel, but less so each year. The ship had grown more comfortable with the other species. It had learned to work with beings from 100 different worlds. The consciousness of the ancient ship had expanded, had become something larger and more complex, had taken on characteristics from every being who came into contact with it. One day, sat in the observation chamber with Lisa. She had never aged much during the years of the Confederation. Something about working with the Sentinel had slowed her aging, or perhaps the work itself kept her vital and alive. She looked at with eyes that had seen the birth of a new galaxy-wide civilization. She asked him if he missed the simplicity of his old life before the Sentinel had chosen him. Looked out at the stars that filled the void beyond the Sentinel's windows. He saw ships of 100 different designs moving in coordinated patterns. He saw beings who had once been enemies now working together on joint projects. He saw a galaxy that was learning to be at peace. He told her that he had never felt more human than he did now. The Sentinel had not asked him to become something other than what he was. It had not forced him to abandon his nature or change his fundamental character. It had only asked him to be fully himself, to let his human qualities shine in all their messy, creative, compassionate glory. Working with the Sentinel had made him more human, not less. And Lisa sat together in silence, watching the stars. The Sentinel hummed around them, its consciousness vast and ancient and patient. The ancient ship had waited millions of years for someone to understand it, to unlock the true power that the architects had built into its systems. That power was not the weapons or the shields or the engines. The true power was the ability to help different kinds of beings understand each other and choose peace over conflict. On the anniversary of the day the Sentinel first woke, the entire Confederation gathered to celebrate. Ships from 83 species filled the space around the ancient vessel. The celebration was a mixture of every kind of culture and tradition and joy that those species possessed. Some beings danced in ways that no human could imitate. Some sang in harmonies that made the very air vibrate. Some celebrated through the exchange of knowledge, sharing wisdom and stories and the beauty of their civilizations. Watched the celebration from the highest observation deck, and he knew that this was his legacy. Not just the work he had done with the Sentinel, but the world he had helped to create. A world where difference was not a reason for conflict, but an opportunity for growth. A world where understanding could triumph over fear. A world where a simple mechanic from Earth could help a galaxy learn to be at peace. The Sentinel pulsed gently around him, and in that pulse was the echo of ancient hopes finally realized. In that pulse was the investment of the architects in goodness and peace, paying dividends across millions of years. In that pulse was the future, bright and full of possibility, stretching forward to the end of time itself. Had come to salvage a dead ship and had ended up helping to save a galaxy. And in doing so, he had finally found home. Eth spent 3 days aboard the Sentinel. They did not speak much, but they listened. They watched. They learned what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. On the 4th day, Eth returned to their fleet and made an announcement. They would not attack the Confederation. Instead, they would join it. They would disarm their weapons. They would lay down their fears and try something new. The announcement shocked the galaxy. A power that had been built on military domination, that had ruled through strength and control, had chosen peace. The news spread from world to world. If they could change, so could anyone. The Confederation grew again. 50 species became 60. 60 became 70. Stood on the observation deck with the Sentinel humming around him. The ship showed him the future, not as a certainty, but as a possibility. It showed him worlds at peace. It showed him beings of different species working together, learning together, building together. It showed him what the architects had dreamed of when they built the Sentinel so long ago. The old mechanic who had come to salvage a dead ship had found something far greater. He had found purpose. He had found a way to make a difference across the entire galaxy. And he had learned that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was not a weapon or a shield or an engine. It was the simple human ability to reach out across the void and say, "Let us understand each other." Dee believed that intelligence and creativity and compassion could triumph over fear and suspicion. Understood now that the architects had not been wrong. Humanity had been young when the Sentinel was built. Earth had been barely noticed in the vast galaxy, but humans had a gift. They could look at something alien and understand it. They could look at something broken and fix it. They could look at conflict and find peace. The constellation of ships that made up the Confederation began to move toward the Sentinel. They came not as conquerors, but as partners. They came to learn. They came to build something new. They came to prove that even the most alien beings could find common ground. For peace just as strongly as they felt it. The Empire commander understood the peaceful hopes of the Syndicate of Free Colonies. The Syndicate understood the caution of the Collective. The Collective understood the curiosity of the... For the first time, species that had been divided by fear and suspicion and misunderstanding felt what it meant to truly connect with something alien and find that connection was beautiful. But understood the truth. The weapons were not what mattered. The real power of the Sentinel was something else. The real power was what it could teach. The real power was what it could show the galaxy about how different beings could work together. Commander stood next to as they looked at the ancient systems coming alive with purpose. She asked him if he was afraid, thought about that question for a long time before he answered. He said no. He was not afraid. He was home. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged and exactly what he was supposed to do.